This episode is sponsored by Cribble. Stick around after the episode for a message from them. Multi-cloud. That is, running the same workload across multiple cloud providers in a completely agnostic way is absolutely something you need to be focusing on, at least according to two constituencies. The first is declining vendors that realize that if you don't go multi-cloud, they will have nothing left to sell you. AWS isn't going to build a multi-cloud dashboard, so VMware, motto, the payday lenders of technical debt, will absolutely build and sell you one with a smile on their face. The second is niche players, which is Gartner speak for crappy, in the public cloud space, who realize that if you go all in on just one cloud provider, it will absolutely not be them. Speaking as neither one of those two constituencies, I'm much more interested in what's right for you and your company. The single disclaimer that I'm going to make here is that I'm talking about best practices, which you should hear as sensible defaults. If you have a considered reason why something I'm saying doesn't apply to your situation, you're almost certainly correct. A customer demands it is one such reason, and people will actually die if this service goes down is another. You have to be where your customers are if you're a SaaS vendor, you have to obey your regulators, and if you have a considered reason why your workload needs to span multiple providers, you're almost certainly correct. In other words, I'm calling multi-cloud a worst practice to be avoided by default. Every company is a multi-cloud company if you squint hard enough. Where I work at the Duckbill Group, we use G Suite or Workspaces or whatever the hell they're calling it this week for collaboration because it's great. We use AWS for infrastructure because it's there. We use GitHub for all of our code repositories because centralizing decentralized systems is what we do as an industry. And IBM Model M buckling spring keyboards to express passive aggression toward our family during these unprecedented times or our colleagues in offices because I'm personally obnoxious. This is not what I'm talking about. That's just good business sense across the board. If someone suggests that you go all in on AWS, it implies that this means using Amazon Chime and WorkDocs and CodeCommit. That person is actively attempting to sabotage you, and you should stop listening to this and call corporate security immediately because those things aren't good. What I'm referring to instead is the idea of building workloads that can seamlessly run across any cloud provider or your own data centers with equal ease. Note that data centers and a public cloud provider paired together is known as hybrid, which is a separate rant for a separate time. I agree with the vision of being able to flow across different providers. It's compelling, and it's something I would very much enjoy. However, it's about as practical as saying, just write bug-free code to your developers, or actually trying to find the spherical cow that your physics models dictate should exist. It's harder than it looks. Yes, every cloud provider can run containers that you hurl their way. This is the promise that Kubernetes has brought to life. If you're not familiar, Kubernetes is an open source project out of Google that's named after the Greek god of spending money on cloud services. The trouble is that a cloud provider is only a pile of disks, some network, and a bunch of servers to run containers on by the very broadest definition of cloud, or, what IBM seems to think it means. Those basic primitives exist everywhere. AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Oracle Cloud, IBM Cloud, and your terrifying data center. If you treat all of those environments as being the same thing, that means that every additional service that's any higher order than those baseline base offerings is close to you. Load balancers work slightly differently on every cloud platform, so being multi-cloud means you're probably running your own with Nginx or HA proxy. The same story applies to databases, monitoring systems, security permissions models, anything that's event-driven. A service mesh, an object store, and oh my God, you haven't even thought about compliance yet, have you? Yes, I know what you're about to say. The industry as a collective whole has been doing all of this for a long time. We haven't magically forgotten how to run all of these things ourselves. My point is that while you're spending time configuring HA proxy to route requests to the proper containers when the right conditions are met and the stars align, one of your competitors has configured an application load balancer to do this with 3 lines of YAML and is now moving forward on building the thing that actually matters to their business goals. We'll ignore entirely the fact the managed version of the load balancer has way better availability, durability, reliability, and resiliency than the thing you're cobbling together. You're not leveraging the best of both worlds, you're improving your data center at the expense of your cloud environment. Another common rationale for multi-cloud is to avoid lock-in to a single vendor. I have some bad news for you. You're already locked in. You're locked in either to technology selections, databases are a common one here, or to soft lock-in via things that don't port super well. Whatever your cloud provider's identity and access management story is, it's almost certainly not congruent with that of other cloud providers, or to what I'll call buy-in. Of those, buy-in is the only real killer, and coincidentally, seems to be the one that no one outside of engineering really thinks about. In other words, what happens when you announce a global migration from AWS to Oracle Cloud? Well, to start, at least a third of your engineering staff will quit to go work down the road with their existing skill sets on a platform that other companies are using more deeply than you are. It's hard to learn a new provider's ins, outs, and most importantly, how it's going to fail. It's way easier to just go ever deeper into the existing ecosystem you're already familiar with. It's also way more valuable from the employee's perspective. Companies don't want to hire generalists who are broad across multiple providers. They bias for specialists who are really good on the one particular platform they have problems on. This may not be intuitively true to you if you look at job postings. It becomes much more understandable if you then filter out the jobs that pay the eye-wateringly high salaries. As a direct result of this, virtually all of the growth that the cloud providers demonstrate in their quarterly earnings isn't coming from convincing other cloud providers' customers to switch. Instead, it's a combination of people migrating in from data centers as well as workloads that are net new. It's hard to migrate from a data center to a cloud provider, even when, at least in theory, you already know all the knobs and dials for your data center environment. Going from one cloud to a different cloud is at least 10 times more complicated, and neither companies nor employees are particularly gung-ho about signing up for that particular brand of pain. You may wisely interject. If I have 2 cloud providers, I can use one to beat the other into offering better discount terms. Nice theory, but in most circumstances, it's a swing and a miss. This isn't vendor management as written in the bad old days of having to deal with big telco. Every cloud provider of substance, and also Google Cloud, zing, negotiate discount percentages based upon percentage of your total spend and the amount of that spend you're committing. Cutting your spend in half reduces the base from which you're negotiating. But let's pretend for a second that you're a company with incredibly portable workloads, and they do exist, that can in fact transition workloads from one provider to another basically seamlessly. Every time we've seen this happen with our clients, the discounting achieved from that threat is less than the discount that the customer would get simply by committing to higher spend levels. Remember, when we fix the horrifying AWS bill, a large part of that is negotiating an awful lot of large-scale cloud contracts. It's not as interesting to put on Twitter as, this is what we wind up doing for optimizing a workload, but negotiation is very real here. Let me be clear. $9 million a year on one provider versus $3 million a year each on 3 providers yields remarkably different costs even before you factor in the expensive management and engineering overhead of making those systems play well together. And now you're negotiating discounts on the basis of $3 million a year, and you have to do it 3 times. Talk about cutting off your nose to spite your face. That's not even getting into the challenge that in all likelihood, instead of improving your durability, you've now created 3 distinct single points of failure. Further, regardless of what provider you pick, once a cloud vendor runs your production infrastructure, they cease being your vendor and instead become your partner, whether you want them to be or not. Adversarial relationships aren't nearly as productive as collaborative ones. I'm not suggesting that you leave money on the table. They won't. But be smart about what you're asking for. In practice, the unspoken rule of the cloud is that things get less expensive over time. We've seen that borne out by every price change from every provider, with the single exception of Google Cloud, which has completely shafted its customers 3 times now. The first was in their 14x increase for some customers on Google Maps API access. Okay, everyone gets a mulligan. The second was when they began charging for previously free GKE cluster management. Okay, the third and most egregious was somewhat recent when they jacked prices on data transfer and some object storage, and that takes effect later in 2022. We can thus safely declare that GCP is a special case from which you really want to have a rapid exodus plan should you need it. In practice, every "we're multi-cloud" story that I've ever seen in the wild means we're over 80% on our primary provider and then have a smattering of workloads on others. Any choice you make constrains your options. Multi-cloud is the embodiment of the ideal. Indecision is the key to flexibility. The trouble is that you're going to spend so much time avoiding making a commitment to one provider that you're going to spend an ever-increasing amount of engineering toil keeping your environment functional at a relatively basic level, and you're going to really struggle to innovate as a business as a result. As Ben Kehoe so eloquently states, multi-cloud is like cow tipping. We know it doesn't exist because there are no videos of cow tipping on YouTube. In this case, there are no articles or conference talks of companies talking about their successful multi-cloud strategies paying off. To really drive that point home, consider this. VMware's entire business these days is predicated on this multi-cloud bet paying off. And yet, VMworld 2019's keynote featured a fictional company called Tanzu Teas making hilariously awful technology choices to use a whole bunch of different cloud providers interchangeably, rather than an actual customer using these things, because real companies just don't make IT decisions this poorly. Well, okay, it may be that perhaps more accurate to say that they don't make decisions that are this bad and then admit to them on stage. If vendors that are themselves highly incentivized to demonstrate multi-cloud success stories can't find anyone to get up on stage and talk about it, what does that tell you about the model's viability? If you're anything like me, you're going to watch this, believe you're a special case to which none of the above constraints or caveats apply, and try for multi-cloud anyway. You do you. You know your business far better than I do. I just have one suggestion. Before you go whole hog barreling into a second cloud provider, first spin up an active environment across 2 regions in your current cloud provider. With complete service and API compatibility between those regions, it should, by this theory, be a piece of cake. Come back and talk to me after you've done that, and then we're going to see how simple and straightforward this really is. Fundamentally, multi-cloud is the wrong answer. It's going to take more than an imaginary company's success story to convince me otherwise.
And now, a word from our sponsor.
It's called a data lake because it's where your business problems go to drown themselves. Increasingly, that data is observability data, and we're all drowning in it already. You need an observability pipeline. The problem is that the real pipeline is in fact the one going from your wallet to a bunch of vendors. Cribble fixes this with a host of innovative answers in this space, including my personal favorite, the ability to replay observability data and send it to other places as if it were new when you need to. Keep your data economically without sacrificing flexibility all at the same time. Try it yourself for free with Cribble Cloud. smash the link along with the like and subscribe buttons while you're down there and check them out. Or don't, and drown your company in the data transfer bill instead.